And this is Darwin's historical scientific method. When you're trying to explain an event in the remote past, you want to draw on your knowledge of cause and effect. And if the effect is a lot of new digital information, we know of a cause that can do that, and it's a mind or an intelligence.
Well, here we are on the Sunday Special with special guest Stephen Meyer. He's the author of the book Darwin's Doubt, an intelligent design advocate. Well, Stephen, thanks so much for joining the Ben Shapiro Show.
Absolutely.
So let's start from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Because people are going to ask. So you talk a lot about evolution and science. Obviously, your books, Darwin's Doubt and Signature in the Cell, are both heavily scientific. So what is your scientific background, so folks know?
Well, I started double majored in physics and geology. And then I worked as a geophysicist for 5 years in industry and went from there to do the program in the philosophy of science, specifically philosophy of biology at Cambridge University, where my PhD dissertation was on the origin of life problem, which it's a very interdisciplinary question. How did life first arise from presumably the non-living chemicals? So it had biochemistry, molecular biology, thermodynamics, information theory. It's a question that has lots of different subjects involved. So it was a very interdisciplinary PhD.
Okay, so with all of that said, if you go to your Wikipedia page, the first thing that it says is that you are the advocate of a pseudo-scientific theory called intelligent design. So let's start with a couple of questions on that. One of the biggest, probably the biggest argument against intelligent design, obviously, is made by the new atheists. And it's fascinating to watch the crossover between neo-Darwinian thinkers and the new atheists. They basically are the same group of people.
They're the same group of people, absolutely.
So it seems to me that...
No surprise, because Dawkins said, that Darwinism makes it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And also the Darwinian view, the strictly Darwinian view, is not just the idea of evolution as change over time, but the idea of an undirected, unguided process that produced the appearance but not the reality of design. So they see nature essentially as being a self-creating entity that can produce all the wonders of and intricacies of living organisms without any guiding hand whatsoever. And so that lends itself to a strictly materialistic or atheistic worldview.
Well, people have suggested that intelligent design advocates are anti-evolution, that they don't believe in the theory of evolution. So what does the theory of evolution say, to start, and then what in it is an argument too far?
That's a great question. The term evolution is a term that has multiple meanings. So if you want to avoid the fallacy of equivocation, it's really good to define terms right from the beginning. So first meaning is change over time. Obviously, and that can mean a couple different things itself. It can refer to the small-scale variation that we see with things like the Galapagos finches, where their beaks get a little bigger, a little smaller in response to varying weather conditions. We see evidence of design at the loci of the design are when you get the major innovations occurring in the history of life. But the information that is present in a major group of organisms might be sufficient to allow a lot of variation within an envelope. So that's why there is evolution. We think there's clearly evolution that takes place. The question is how much information was present and how wide the envelopes of variability are that are generated by that information. So there's a terrific evolutionary biologist and cell biologist at the University of Chicago, also named Shapiro, James Shapiro, who's got a new theory of evolution he calls natural genetic engineering. And he notices that, and has documented that many of the mutations that we actually see at work are not random at all. They're an expression of what he calls pre-programmed adaptive capacity, where there's an external trigger or stress put on an organism, and that triggers the production of certain proteins for which the organism had the capability of building all along because it had the genetic information there. And so a lot of the evolution we see is actually pre-programmed adaptive capacity, which is really an exciting biological phenomenon that the Darwinians haven't really taken full account of, but it does raise the question of the origin of that adaptive capacity. Where'd the pre-programming come from? So intelligent design says the inputs of information from outside the system, from an intelligence, are located in that pre-programmed adaptive capacity, but the theory also acknowledges that there is evolution possible going downstream as a result of that pre-existing information. Second big meaning of evolution is the idea that all forms of life are connected by common ancestry back to a single ancestral form, a single one-celled organism. So Darwin represented that idea with his concept of the tree of life. That's an idea of evolution that's consistent with the idea of intelligent design. Those many intelligent design proponents and other scientists, including evolutionary biologists, are getting increasingly skeptical about it because there's so much evidence of discontinuity in the fossil record and discontinuity in the study of genomics, where we have things like orphan genes, which are big classes of genes that are unique to certain taxa and don't show any similarity to other genes anywhere else in the genomic databases. So you have this sense of genetic information popping into existence in different classes of organisms, discontinuity.
My name's Tim Standish. I work at the Geoscience Research Institute, which is located in Loma Linda in Southern California. I'm currently at the Faith and Science conference in St. George, Utah. And one of the topics that I've talked about is the relationship between chimpanzees and human beings. Obviously, if you look at chimpanzees, they are more like humans than, let's say, bananas or worms or something like that. So it wouldn't be unexpected to find that there is some genetic similarity between humans and chimpanzees. I want to draw your attention to a couple of texts right here at the beginning of the Bible. I'm going to read Genesis 2:7, and this is talking about the creation of human beings. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. So here we have the Lord God forming human beings and breathing the breath of life into them, and that's what makes them human. Some people look at this and they say, aha, look at how different the creation was of humans relative to other kinds of animals. But in reality, that's not what the Bible teaches. If you go down just a few verses from Genesis 2:7 to Genesis 2:19, we have an account of how the animals were made. Out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to Adam. So the Lord God formed the animals also out of the ground, just as he formed humans out of the ground. But what about the breath of life? To figure out that, you actually have to go down a few more chapters to Genesis chapter 7. This is when all the animals were being brought onto the ark. And here in Genesis 7 verse 15 it says, and they, this is the animals, went into the ark to Noah 2 by 2 of all flesh in which is the breath of life. So what we see is that animals and humans were formed in a very similar way. They were formed by the Lord God out of the dust of the ground, and they have the breath of life. Same creator, same materials, same everything. So it shouldn't be surprising to discover that there are similarities between animals and human beings, or that human beings, in fact, are a special kind of animal. Now, obviously, humans were created in the image of God. Dogs were not, even though they're lovely in their own way. There is something very special about humans, but we are not physically different in some way from the other animals. So some similarity is what is expected. But when you do look at how the chromosomes are arranged in human beings versus those in chimpanzees, there are profound differences. When you look at the ends of the chromosomes on chimpanzees and human chromosomes, there are profound differences. When you look at where certain kinds of genetic recombination occur within the genomes of chimpanzees and human beings, you see profound differences. In other words, you see lots and lots of differences that are not expressed in terms of just a simple percentage. When it's all said and done, my opinion is that the case for common ancestry between human beings and chimpanzees is weak at best. I believe that there were separate origins for these two groups of organisms.
There are many others. I've written an article with a German paleontologist, Günter Beckley, about 17 such major discontinuities: the mammalian radiation, the origin of flowering plants, the first winged insects, the first dinosaurs. Most of the major groups of living forms on Earth arise discontinuously. So that's a big deal. Third meaning of evolution is the one, though, that's really contentious. And that's the idea that natural selection and random mutation are sufficient to produce all the new forms of life and the appearance of design that living forms manifest. So it's an unguided process that produces the appearance, but not the reality of design. And that's the meaning of evolution that the theory of intelligent design is challenging. There's some intelligent design proponents may be skeptical about common descent, others are not, but it's that third meaning that unites us, and it's what the theory of intelligent design is about. We're challenging the idea that purely undirected processes can produce the complexity or the information necessary to build the complexity of living organisms.
So let's talk about information theory. So for folks who haven't read your books, don't know anything about information theory, why does information theory suggest that there must be some sort of designer? Obviously, people like Dawkins, who suggest that evolution is the universal acid. They say that these things can arise by themselves. They would also make the suggestion that the information in DNA is not necessarily directed, that it only seems directed to us because we're here to actually look at the direction in which it moves. It could theoretically be random. What does information theory have to say about this stuff?
It's actually helpful first to go back to the molecular biological revolution of the 1950s. Watson and Crick discover in 1953, they elucidate, rather, the structure of the DNA molecule. They discover it's got this beautiful helix structure. There's these 4 chemical subunits that run along the interior of the helix called bases or nucleotide bases. In 1957, 1958, Crick, who was interestingly a code breaker in World War II, posits what's known as the sequence hypothesis, which is just a breakthrough moment in the history of biology, where he realizes that the nucleotide bases on the inside of the double helix are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written language, or what we now think of as like the zeros and ones in a section of software code, which is to say it's not the physical or chemical properties of those bases that is important to their function, but rather it's their sequential arrangement in accord with an independent code, which was later elucidated and we now call the genetic code. So what we have is a true information-bearing system that is expressing information as it happens for building the proteins and protein machines that cells need to stay alive. So in Seattle, where I live, we've got great information companies. We've got Microsoft, which writes code. We've got Boeing and other manufacturing companies that use code. And there's a process called computer-assisted design and manufacturing, CAD/CAM, where an engineer might write some code would go down a wire, be converted into another machine language that could be read by a manufacturing apparatus, and that information will then direct the construction of a mechanical system. If you're at Boeing, it might put rivets exactly in the right place on the airplane wing. So you've got and the same thing that's going on inside the cell, that you've got information directing the construction of proteins and protein machines that are absolutely necessary for survivability. So the big question is, where does that information come from? And also, what kind of information is it? And that's where the information theory comes in.
So this is where we get into the theories of probability, because the question becomes, could there have been such a strand of DNA that comes about by chance? Because the theory, obviously, as you mentioned, of evolution suggests that it's mutations now in the DNA that create all of the change in human life over time. So we'll skip the origin of life problem for just a second, and then we'll. Yeah. But when it comes to the information string in the DNA, the contention is basically that given enough time, you run the experiment enough times, and eventually you will end up with an evolution that, and combined with natural selection, it preserves the mutations that are good, and you will end up with something that looks designed even though it is not designed. That mutation over time being preserved by natural selection is enough. Why doesn't that work?
There's a mathematical problem, and it's a profound one. My colleague David Berlinski calls it the combinatorial problem, or the problem of combinatorial inflation. Maybe a simple analogy, way to get into it. We know from our experience with software code, writing and using it, that the last thing you want in a section of functional software code is a series of random changes to those zeros and ones. if that happens, you're going to degrade the information that's in that code long before you'll ever generate a new software program or operating system. And Richard Dawkins and many, many others, biologists, have acknowledged that what we have in DNA is akin to machine code, or as Leroy Hood puts it, digital code. It's functioning in exactly the same way. So what we've learned from software writing and using is highly relevant to understanding whether or not the mutation selection mechanism would actually could generate conceivably or realistically new information. And there's a reason that changing software at random invariably degrades the information before you get anything useful and new. And that is because there's so many more ways to go wrong. In any system of digital or typographic or alphabetic communication, there are vastly more ways of arranging the characters in question that will generate gibberish than there are ways of arranging those same characters that will generate something functional. So if you start randomly changing things, you're overwhelmingly more likely to find a gibberish sequence than a functional one. And as we've actually tried to quantify that, how much more likely, the quantitative odds are prohibitive. There's a scientist who worked for 14 years at Cambridge University named Douglas Axe. Did his PhD at Caltech, went on to do a long-term molecular biology research postdoc at Cambridge to try to quantify this question. How rare or common are the functional sequences that would make a new protein or a new gene capable of making a new protein? How rare are the functional ones in comparison to the non-functional ones? And for a relatively short protein, about 150 amino acids long, he determined that the ratio of functional to non-functional sequences was about 1 over 10 to the 77th power. Now, to put that in context, there are only 10 to the 65th atoms in the Milky Way galaxy. So what that means is that a random search for a new functional sequence is going to be like looking for one marked atom among 10 trillion, it'd be 1 trillion galaxies of the size of the Milky Way. So, and what turns out that even 4 billion years of life's history is not enough time to solve a search problem of that magnitude. And I go into all the math of this in the book, and it's pretty straightforward. There's only 10 to the 40th organisms in the history of the planet, not enough replication events to search a space 10 to the 77 big. So you're looking at, even in the whole, if you take the whole history of life on the planet into account, you're only going to be able to search a tiny, tiny fraction of the total relevant sequences. So you got a really big haystack, really small number of needles, and very little time to look for them. The bottom line is it's overwhelmingly more probable that such a search will fail than succeed in the known time of life on planet Earth, which means that the mechanism is more likely to, the hypothesis that the mechanism produced new information is more likely to be false than true.
And so the result of this is, as you say, that it's more likely that it's designed than that it was randomly done in terms of DNA, and that's reflected in the fossil record, to the extent that there's sort of these jumps in the fossil record, and this is what you talk about in Darwin's Doubt, is that it's not a continuous process of mutation upon mutation building one on the other just randomly.
It becomes a big engineering problem, because it's not just that there's gaps in the fossil record. You have to ask, well, how would the evolutionary process produce all the new information necessary to build these completely new body plans, new cell types, new anatomical structures? And we know it would take a lot of new information. And so then you've got to look, well, is there enough time to do that? Do you have enough trials through this mechanism? And the answer is just overwhelmingly no. It's not plausible at all mathematically.
Okay, so it seems like the biggest blowback that you've gotten, obviously, in terms of intelligent design is the term intelligent design, because it seems like most of the critiques that you've made of neo-Darwinism are fairly well accepted. Is that accurate?
Increasingly so. In 2016, a number of us attended a conference at the Royal Society of London in, obviously London, and it was a group of leading evolutionary biologists called the meeting to address new trends in evolutionary biology, they called it. It was an innocuous way of saying neo-Darwinism is dead, and we need a new theory. The first talk at the conference was by a leading Austrian evolutionary biologist named Gerd Müller, who enumerated 5 what he called explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism. Elsewhere, he's written that neo-Darwinism has no theory of the generative, by which he means it explains the small-scale variations very well, like the Galapagos finches, but it doesn't explain the origin of major innovations in the history of life. And so many evolutionary biologists are now, there's an aphorism that's afoot. It's mutation and selection explain the survival, but not the arrival of the fittest. The problem is the main mechanism of evolutionary change doesn't seem to have significant creative power. And that's the problem, I think, increasingly being recognized. And as a result of that, many people within evolutionary biology are looking for new mechanisms, calling for the formulation of a new theory. And that's kind of striking. It's an astounding admission when you think about how the theory is presented through the textbooks, with science popularizers, the new atheists, the public spokesman for science, the National Center for Science Education, or the National Academy of Sciences. When they talk about evolution, it's a fact. Richard Dawkins has said that if you find someone who questions it, they're either stupid, wicked, or insane. But the reality on the ground, or rather in the peer-reviewed literature within evolutionary biology, is very different. There's a recognition that the fundamental problems haven't been solved, and one of which is, Mueller acknowledged, the problem of the origin of biological form. When I saw that, it's in a table in a book that he's written with another evolutionary biologist, is a list of unsolved problems, one of which they list the origin of biological form. I was stunned. That's 2003, MIT Press. That was the very problem that Darwin was supposed to have solved in 1859, and it's now an open question.
I'm skeptical of the claim.
I'm skeptical.
I'm skeptical.
Yes, I'm
skeptical.
We are skeptical
of claims for the ability of
Random mutations
And natural selection
to account for the complexity of life.
A careful examination
of the evidence
for Darwinian theory
should be encouraged.
skeptical
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 of claims
for the ability of random mutations
and natural selection
to account for
the complexity
The complexity
to account for the complexity of life.
Careful examination
of the evidence
for Darwinian theory
should be encouraged.
And on the flip side, we do know, however, of a cause that is sufficient to produce new information. This is why it's not a God of the gaps or an argument from ignorance, is we're drawing, and this is Darwin's historical scientific method. When you're trying to explain an event in the remote past, you want to draw on your knowledge of cause and effect. What kind of cause is out there that we've observed that is capable of producing the effect in question? And if the effect is a lot of new digital information, we know of a cause that can do that, and it's a mind or an intelligence. And it happens that's the only known cause that can produce lots of new information, and it's certainly much more plausible than the Darwinian idea of a random search. And we show why mathematically it's much more plausible.
Now, one of the theories about the idea that randomness is still in the system is Stephen Jay Gould's idea of punctuated equilibrium, that essentially small groups of animals kind of went away from the big group, they did all their changes, and then they reintegrated. Why doesn't that work? The idea that the jumps in the fossil record are a result of small groups breaking away in a certain level of group selection.
Yeah, Gould's model was a terrific advance as far as its accuracy in describing the fossil record, because he described these big punctuations or big jumps, and then the long-term stasis that would occur, lack of directional evolutionary change. That's what we see in the fossil record, very non-Darwinian. The problem was he didn't really have a mechanism that could accomplish that could produce the amount of change that we're seeing. I discussed it as a whole I do a whole chapter on this in Darwin's Doubt, but the mechanism he proposed was called species selection. A lot of other evolutionary biologists, including Richard Dawkins, were very critical of the mechanism, and in a way rightly so, because what it came down to in the end was that species selection itself depended on the natural selection random mutation mechanism. And that mechanism requires lots of time to get the job done. And it turns out 4 billion years isn't enough, but certainly the abrupt jumps that Gould was talking about were not allowing the mechanism enough time to work. So you had this kind of irony in evolutionary biology in the 80s and 90s in particular. Gould's model pretty much was dismissed by the early 2000s, but you had Gould's model was viewed as a good one for describing the fossil record accurately, but it didn't have a mechanism. The Darwinians had a mechanism, but it was inconsistent with the fossil record. And also then, as we've later critiqued, the mechanism was also lacked the creative power to generate the information necessary to build big new, major innovations in the history of life.
How is this a scientific theory as opposed to just, as maybe Richard Dawkins would say, a God of the gaps argument?
Well, one of the things I did when I first set off to grad school, my story is that I encountered this information argument. One of the most extraordinary discoveries of 20th century biology is that at the foundation of life is information in a digital form. The DNA molecule stores information in a 4-character digital code. And this discovery of Watson and Crick in the 50s has over time created an impasse in both chemical evolutionary theory, which are the theories about the origin of the first life, and theories of biological evolution as well, which are theories about how you get new forms of life from pre-existing forms. Because to build anything in biology, you've got to have code, you've got to have information. So I became fascinated with that question and the possibility that the information at the foundation of life was actually an indicator of the activity of mind, of an intelligence. But to determine whether or not that argument could be formulated scientifically, I had to dig in a little deeper into how scientists go about reasoning about these origins questions, about events in the remote past. And oddly, one of the people most helpful to me in that was Charles Darwin himself. Because in the 19th century, he and his mentor, Charles Lyell, the great geologist, developed a method for investigating historical scientific questions. And they had a principle of reasoning they called the vera causa principle, or the idea that if you want to explain an event in the remote past, you should posit an event or a cause which is known to have the powers to produce the effect in question. And as I began to think about that, I realized that it was possible to formulate a case for intelligent design in a strictly scientific manner using the method of Lyell and Darwin, because as we think about the origin of information, the one thing we know is that it always arises from an intelligent source, whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or information embedded in a radio signal. Whenever you find information, especially if it's in a digital or alphabetic form, you trace it back to its source, you always come to a mind, not a material process. So using the same scientific method of reasoning that Darwin used, I came to a different non-Darwinian conclusion, which was that there is evidence of intelligent design, not just what the Darwinians call apparent design in the history of life. So if our theory is unscientific, the Darwinian theory would be as well, but I think both are scientific. I just argue for one and critique the other.
We've always been hearing this idea that the more science we know, the less there's a need for God, right? Now that we know where thunder comes from, we don't believe that God is up there throwing lightning bolts. Well, Christians never believed that anyway. We didn't believe in Zeus. But the point is that a lot of people who don't understand the Bible think that that's where God comes from, right? So the narrative is the more science we know, the less there's a need for God. That's obvious. Now that's the old narrative, and nobody updates it. So I'm here to update it and to say that in the last 50-something years, the tide has turned so dramatically that it's a joke.
In the late 40s, there was a scientist named Claude Shannon who developed a mathematical theory of information. But his theory only captured, his theory of information had to do with the reduction of uncertainty, which he showed was inversely related to probability. More improbable an arrangement of characters, the more Shannon information that was carried. But his notion of information didn't capture the notion of meaning or communication function. So you could have a series of characters that were basically gibberish, but because they were aperiodic and random, you couldn't really tell whether they were meaningful or not. But they had a big information measure. So Shannon didn't capture the difference between functional or meaningful information and just an improbable arrangement of characters. So it's actually not information theory, but it's information theory plus a qualitative judgment about what the sequence is doing that allows us to recognize the kind of information that we're familiar with in our own parlance. But the dictionary talks about variable sequences of characters for conveying a meaning or a function. And that's what we have in DNA. And Francis Crick was very clear on that from the beginning. He said it's not mere Shannon information, it's information that's functional. And that's the kind of information that, in our experience, always indicates the prior activity of an intelligence. If it's just a random arrangement, might be undirected processes. But if it's very specific and complex, and it's operating in accord with a symbol convention, then you've got information that is the product of mind.
Is there an easy way out for folks when it comes to the fine-tuning argument or to the information argument by simply saying that there is no such actual distinction between meaningful information and Shannon information? There's no such distinction between fine-tuning and non-fine-tuning, except that we're here to see it. In other words, if the only thing that distinguishes an information-rich segment of text from a non-information-rich segment of text is the fact that we speak English. So if there's a bunch of letters and we can read them, then we think that they're meaningful. If there's a bunch of letters and we can't read them, we think that they're not meaningful. So in other words, are we reverse projecting mind onto a universe simply because we're here to perceive it?
Because we do objectively recognize meaning and function. There is a possibility of false negative judgments. We might see a string of characters and not know the symbol convention, and therefore conclude that that string is just random or complex without being specified. But when we make a qualitative judgment of specificity of arrangement, when we see that the arrangement of characters is necessary to perform an independently observable function, that's a kind of information that is real and is something that we know is only associated with the causal activity of intelligent agents. So no biologist really, when you get down to it, wants to say, well, the sequence of characters in the DNA, the A's, C's, and G's in the DNA molecule, the arrangement doesn't matter for building proteins, because all we have to do is change the arrangement and see that the protein unfolds and doesn't catalyze a reaction. There's a real objective way of recognizing function in biology, just as there is in human language. So I think this qualitative in the information sciences, there's a distinction between specified or functional information on the one hand and mere complexity or randomness or Shannon information on the other. And that's a real distinction, and it underwrites the whole case for intelligent design. You're right.
The philosopher of science Karl Popper has suggested that science is basically that which can be falsified. So what evidence would have to arise for the theory of intelligent design to be falsified?
You would have to find an undirected process that was capable of producing information beyond a threshold that we have defined mathematically. There's a amount of information that might arise by chance based on what are called the probabilistic resources of the universe. But if you get beyond that from an undirected process, that would falsify our claim that only mind can produce that amount of information.
Where is the discontinuity with regard to the establishment of life?
Well, the first big discontinuity is the origin of life itself, which is what my first book, Signature in the Cell, addressed. And many people don't realize that Darwin himself never addressed the question of the origin of the first life. He speculated about it in a letter to a friend, but this was not something he addressed in The Origin of Species. He presupposed the existence of the first living cell. And there's a major discontinuity between chemical processes that we observe and what we see in actual living organisms. And it's a complexity gap that's absolutely extraordinary. We've got tiny miniature machines. We have not only the DNA with the digital code in it, but a complex information processing system, and even the simplest living cells on Earth. So that's a big discontinuity.
But the amazing thing is that every atom in your body came from a star that exploded. And the atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than your right hand. It really is the most poetic thing I know about physics. You are all stardust. You couldn't be here if stars hadn't exploded, because the elements, the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, iron, all the things that matter for evolution weren't created at the beginning of time. They're created in the nuclear furnaces of stars, and the only way they can get into your body is if the stars were kind enough to explode. So forget Jesus. The stars died so that you could be here today. Okay? And anyway.
All right, so let's talk about the origin of life problem. The question being, how did organic life arise from non-organic material? There are some experiments that were done in the early 20th century in which, under certain conditions, it looked as though maybe organic material could be created from non-organic material, but there really, as you point out, has not been a great explanation of how non-organic material could create an information system like DNA. I was wondering if you could elucidate that.
So yeah, the famous experiment still in a lot of the biology textbooks is the Miller-Urey experiment of 1952, 1953. They sparked a chamber that had gases known as reducing gases that then spontaneously produced a few of the 20 protein-forming amino acids, 2 or 3. Problem is that amino acids do not a protein make, and proteins by themselves do not make life. So they were really quite a long ways away from demonstrating anything like a spontaneous chemical origin of life. It's ironic that that experiment was performed in the same year as Watson and Crick's discovery of the structure of the DNA molecule and the subsequent elucidation of the information-bearing properties of the molecule. Because in what's called chemical evolutionary theory, by the 1960s and certainly by the early 1980s, the field reached a state of impasse precisely because the biologists and the biochemists realized that to build an actual living cell, you've got to have information-rich molecules. You can't just have the components. You can't just have the letters. You've got to have the sentences. And so there were a number of problems with the Miller-Urey experiment. One was they presupposed conditions on the early Earth and in the early Earth's atmosphere that didn't actually match the conditions on the early Earth. We didn't have a reducing atmosphere. We had a slightly oxidizing or neutral atmosphere. You rerun those experiments, you don't get amino acids forming spontaneously. But the bigger problem was, how do you arrange the amino acids in the very specific ways that are required to form a three-dimensional structure called a protein fold? And that problem hasn't been solved apart from watching DNA do it inside living cells. So to build proteins, what we know is you need information stored in the DNA molecule. And so as the molecular biological revolution unfolded in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the scientists working on the origin of life realized the problem was much harder than they realized, because they didn't just need to account for certain kinds of building blocks of life. They needed to account for the information that would organize the building blocks into DNA molecules, into protein molecules, and into the complex information processing systems that characterize even the simplest living cells.
You try to build a cell, even hypothetically, get the dream team, get the smartest people together. Can they build a living cell? I'll give you all the chemicals you want in homochiral form. And I'll give you even the informational code. I'll give you the whole code. In other words, you tell me how you want the DNA set up. I'll give it all to you. Now just assemble a cell. Go ahead. You got all your diacyl lipids all in chiral form. Make your protocell. Make it, put in your peptides any way you want, set it up, get your carbohydrates out there. I'll even hook the carbohydrates together. You just tell me the pattern you want. Then you got to stick them on your cell. Can you do it? No, nobody can. Nobody's ever done it. Nobody can do it. That's not to say it won't ever be done. I'm just telling you, as of today, it hasn't been done, and it's far, far away from being able to do it. People will quote to me this, synthetic cells. Well, in 2010, Craig Venter's group copied an existing bacterial genome and transplanted it into another cell. So what happens? I buy, say, a Corvette. And so what do? I take the computer control box out of that Corvette, and I go to my clean room at the university, and I copy the chips. I copy them. And I put my chips that I copied into that control box, and I go back and I stick that in my Corvette. And I say, I built that Corvette. I made that Corvette. I did that. You just copied the same chip and you put it back in. That's all he did. He took another one in 2016 and he did something similar, but he took the control box and he knocked out all but 473 of the working devices, and he stuck it back in the cell. And like, whoa, you made a cell. No, he didn't. You just made a cell worse. You just chopped out a bunch of stuff and left just a few pieces to keep it operating enough. He didn't make the cell. There's all this complexity, all these interactomes. Nobody ever made that. Nobody knows how to do it. Next slide. Are there any synthetic organic chemists in here? Any synthetic chemists here? Any synthetic chemists? Get your hand up high. One there. Okay. So and one there. Okay. If I say something that's not true, I want you to stand up and just say liar. All right? If I say something that's not true, just stand up. All right? Because I want these people to know, for all they know, I'm lying. You have to verify on this. So then here's an article from 12 December 2018. So this is like a month ago. This comes out now in Nature Communications, Prebiotic Chemistry and Human Intervention. So now they're saying, yeah, if you're really going to copy prebiotic chemistry, you can't have too much intervention. So they're beginning to catch on. I'm surprised the journal took this. He says, such a pure chemical scenario is unrealistic prebiotically, but necessary. He's saying if you want to do something prebiotic, you got to have clean chemicals. He says, nobody's really explained this. Furthermore, the ideal experiment does not involve any human intervention. So this is this guy, Clemens Richard. They're beginning to catch on. Next slide. How close have researchers come to making an artificial cell? Well, we know now. We know how close they've come. How do we know? Because in November 2018, that's just a couple months ago, Science magazine, top journal, says biologists create the most lifelike artificial cells. Whoa, I want to see what they've made. Let's see how far along it really is. Next slide. So they're commenting on this article which appeared in Nature Communications in November 2018. Communication and quorum sensing in non-living mimics of eukaryotic cells. Wow, they made these cells and they're communicating with one another, quorum sensing, meaning that they can tell distance between each other. Let me read about this. Next slide. So semi-porous microcapsules were made of plastic, from acrylate polymerization containing clay, were prepared using modern microfluidic techniques done within fabrication devices. So you go into a clean room, you build microfluidic devices, and you polymerize, you make polymers around clay. That's all well known, how to do that. That's what they did. These are plastic shells. Clays have a high affinity for binding DNA because clays are positively charged, DNA is negatively charged. So you add DNA to the solution, it goes through the porous plastic and binds to the clay. Then they buy ribosomes and RNA, enzymes and reagents were purchased or extracted, and they add that to the medium. Those diffuse into. And the normal protein synthesis starts taking place, which is normal synthesis, and then some of that diffuses out of those, and then the nearby ones they add, some of it diffuses into the nearby ones. The ones that are nearer get more diffused into them than the ones further away. Well, duh, that's normal diffusion gradient. The ones that are closer get hit more often. The chemistry is going to work. Next slide. The chemistry of the exogenously added reagents will work regardless of the container, whether it's a plastic semi-porous microcapsule, as was used, in a test tube, or in a large industrial production vat. The chemistry is the same. It's done all the time. You take these biological derived systems, you add them together, proteins will start being made. This is how proteins are made. You know, you buy these drugs. How are they made? They're made in vats. Well, this guy did it in a little microcapsule. That's the most lifelike system that's ever been made, according to Science magazine. That's it. So it is far from the press hype claims of gene expression and communication rivaling that of living cells. That's what the press is saying. There is no rivalry here. No one. Further, one might arguably agree that these are indeed the most lifelike artificial cells yet, but that only serves to underscore the point. Nobody has ever come close to generating the workings of life. Nobody's even close. You do this chemistry in the lab all the time. So they did it in a microporous capsule, and they said, whoa, this is life. My test tube is life then. Here's the ramifications of calling conjectures facts. Claims that mislead the patient taxpayer are unhelpful, and the public will even distrust scientific claims into other fields. Uncorrected or unfounded assertions jeopardize science beyond a singular field, especially since there's mounting distrust of higher education in general. Condescending comments toward the public or a student, if they will not embrace our conjectures as facts, will lead to continued division between our scientists and non-scientists, which can yield public reluctance to fund our research. We must tell the truth with specificity. If it is a fact, say it. If it's not a fact, say it. Blackballing scientists if they bear legitimate nonconformist views by excluding them from professional societies and academies, withholding their funding or denying them tenure is anti-scientific, and it will retard the advancement of science. Next slide.
It does raise the question, if you're a methodological naturalist and all you believe is that undirected processes are responsible for everything, why you believe in such a thing as objective truth, for example, because...
Or the reliability of the human mind, as we were discussing before the interview.
Right, I mean, if the idea is that the human mind is capable of grasping the world around it, and there is such a thing as objective truth that we can grasp, then that would suggest that our mind reflects the universe in some deep, profound way, as opposed to the sort of evolutionary biology belief, which is that we are just adaptable balls of meat. And so whatever we think about the universe, maybe it's helpful in terms of our adaptation, but it's not necessarily true.
It's very well put. This was the very thing that bothered Thomas Nagel, the great philosopher of science from NYU. Nagel got himself into a bit of trouble. He wrote a favorable review of Signature in the Cell in the Times Literary Supplement. And then there was a huge blowback, including from a lot of other fellow atheists. Nagel's an atheist. But Nagel accepted the critical arguments in Signature in the Cell and began to get more critical of Darwinism as well, not just chemical evolutionary theory, but biological evolutionary theory. And in 2012, he doubled down by publishing his own book with Oxford Press called Mind and Cosmos, How the Neo-Darwinian Materialist View of Reality is Almost Certainly False, was the subtitle. And his problem was the one that you just articulated, that clearly we live in a universe in which mind is a reality. And if neo-Darwinism can't account for that, then it's missing something really big. So it's an inadequate explanation for something we observe all the time, which is the activity of minds. I see it in our conversation. I know I have a mind by my own introspective experience. This is a part of reality too. And if evolution can't account for that, and if we exclude mind as an explanatory principle, we're going to have an impoverished understanding of the world around us. And so I think this is a very important aspect of the debate is recognizing that mind is a reality.
Well, this actually is one of the fascinating sort of theories that Dawkins puts forth, is essentially that mind is a spandrel, that mind is just something that we feel like we have, but it actually does not exist in the first place, which does raise the question as to why he does what he does for a living. I mean, if you're in the business of explanation, why bother operating along the spandrels? It's
extremely self-defeating, you're absolutely right. But it's interesting that the neo-Darwinists say that design in life is an illusion. We have apparent design, but not real design. First line from the Blind Watchmaker, page 1. Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. But at the end of the day, Dawkins also has to say that mind itself, purposive intelligence, is also an illusion. That's an impoverished worldview. We all know better than that.
Well, and it does raise questions, I mean, far beyond that for civilization as well, since we all have to live together and reason together. I've had this exact argument with Sam Harris, who says he believes in objective truth and reason, and I keep saying to him, well, we're wandering balls of meat with no purpose in the universe. So what is this reason you're talking about? We're a bunch of firing neurons over which we have no control.
Yeah, two points on that, and I think you've addressed them both, and I think you're addressing the point you just made in your new book. But our whole legal system is based on notions of moral responsibility, culpability before the law. But that presupposes our ability to choose as free agents, that we're not completely determined by undirected firings in our synapse. It was not just nature or nurture. There's human free will and moral responsibility. Our whole legal system is based on that idea. And secondly, we have this epidemic of teen suicide in our country. And I heard something you did on your show a little while ago, and I had a very similar experience of kind of existential anxiety as a young person. I was a fairly middle-class upbringing, had no great deprivation, but I had this recurring question: what's going to matter in 100 years? What will any human achievement ever matter? And this question of the purpose of human existence, I think, is gnawing at a lot of people in our culture, especially young people, because only personal agents can confer meaning on something. Nothing can mean something to a rock or to an atom. And we find meaning in relationship to other persons. And if at the end of the day, we're just going to have this heat death of the universe, and there's no mind behind the universe, no personal agency behind the universe, there's no possibility of ultimate meaning. And a lot of people sense that, and it's very deeply troubling. And we're really not answering that question for a lot of young people. And I think one of the philosophical implications of intelligent design, which doesn't attempt to prove the existence of God, but it does imply that personal agency is fundamental to the cosmos, and it opens up the possibility that there could be a good answer to that question of meaning and purpose that I think is gnawing at a lot of people.
So in the history of science and the philosophy of science, there's been this interesting battle between sort of religious folks who believe that religion should stay separate from science and folks who believe that religion and science are intertwined, and that on the one side, you have sort of the Thomas Aquinas that God and nature speak in the same language. And on the other side, you have the William of Ockham argument that basically God can do whatever he wants. And so what we don't want is a theory of science that can disprove God. And the flip side of that is sort of Stephen Jay Gould's non-overlapping magisteria argument that science handles this stuff and religion handles this stuff, and there's no crossover.
Right.
So where does intelligent design lie in that gap?
That's a really great question. There's basically three different approaches to the interface between science and and religious belief. One is the idea that the two are in conflict, and that was the kind of dominant view that came out of the late 19th century. Most historians of science now reject that as very simplistic. Another view is the Stephen Jay Gould view, is that science and faith occupy non-overlapping realms of inquiry. The Galileo aphorism was science tells you how the planets go, not how to go to heaven, or how the heavens go, not how to go to heaven. But the theory of intelligent design, I think, shows that that's also simplistic. There are many scientific questions and religious questions that are completely separate, but there are some questions that both science and religion speak to. And my view is that when they speak to the same questions in the same way, that there is actually far more agreement than people realize. In fact, substantial agreement. For example, the origin of the universe, we now know, had a beginning, or the universe had a beginning. And this is one of the first words of the biblical text, that there was a beginning. So that's a point of agreement about the same issue. Is the universe finite or infinite? Both science and religion are now telling us the same thing, that the universe had a beginning. Intelligent design is telling us that life and the universe were designed. And that's something that you would also find affirmed in the theistic religious traditions. So that's a point of agreement about a special question, in this case, about the origins of life. So I don't say that science and religion they have many areas of specialized inquiry. There are different questions that each address, but there are overlapping areas of interest. And increasingly, what we found is that there is increasing agreement as we understand the science better. For example, in the General Scholium to the Principia, Newton's great work on gravitation, he's got a terrific argument for design based on the fine-tuning of the planetary orbits. So design arguments were part of science from its foundation, but they became verboten in the late 19th century after the origin of species.
Let's talk for a second about the intelligent designer. So when you say intelligent design, everybody goes to, okay, that's God. But your theory doesn't actually suggest that it's necessarily God. It just says there has to be some form of mind or intelligence that was responsible for this. How do you connect the intelligent design theory to God, or is it connected to God at all?
Right. Thanks for asking. It's a great question. And the first thing is to understand why, from the biological evidence, we make an inference to a mind of some kind. When we're reasoning about the history of life, we're using this Darwinian principle, the vera causa principle, or using our knowledge of cause and effect. What do we know from cause and effect? Well, we know from cause and effect that it takes a mind with self-conscious awareness to create or generate information in a digital form. And so we can infer at least that there was a mind that at least had the kind of capabilities of which we are familiar because of our own introspective experience of having minds. Now, when we're talking about the biological evidence, the designing intelligence responsible might be an immanent intelligence within the cosmos, or it could be a transcendent intelligence that has the attributes that Jews and Christians ascribe to the deity. Both are logical possibilities. So I've always said, in my books on the evidence of design and biology, that the theory of intelligent design isn't an argument for God's existence, but it may have theistic implications. It's theistic friendly. Now, I happen to be writing another book that is extending the design argument into the realm of cosmology and the foundations of physics, where we find at the foundation of physical law these incredibly finely tuned parameters. It's called the anthropic fine-tuning. And the physicists since the 50s and 60s have been discovering dozens of these fine-tuning parameters, both in the way the universe was set up at the beginning and the configuration of mass energy, and in the relative strengths of the different forces of physics and a number of other parameters like the expansion rate of the universe and the speed of light and things like this. And it turns out we live in what they call a Goldilocks universe, that the forces are not too strong, not too weak, the expansion rate not too fast, not too slow, the arrangement of the mass energy just right at the beginning. We live in a just right universe that has made life possible. Now that, I argue, and many physicists have argued, is also evidence of design, but that evidence of design is located at the very beginning of the universe. And neither the beginning of the universe, which we now know of as a result of our Big Bang theory, nor the fine-tuning can be accounted for by an agent within the cosmos. Clearly, no space alien or immanent intelligence could be responsible for the laws of physics and the fine-tuning of all those laws that make its very life possible. Nor could such an agent be responsible for the origin of the universe itself. So I think when you bring that other evidence into the picture, I think you can make a very strong theistic design argument. And in my next book, which is going to be called the return of the God hypothesis, I look at how theism, as opposed to other competing metaphysical hypotheses, such as pantheism or materialism or deism, best explains that ensemble of evidence from biology, physics, and cosmology. So I do think you can make a theistic argument, not a proof for God's existence, but again, an inference to the best explanation of this ensemble of evidence we have about biological and cosmological origins.
The countervailing case for a lot of this stuff is the theory of multiple universes.
I was hoping you would ask about that. Yeah,
people essentially saying that we are a bubble universe that is on a bunch of other bubbles, and that there are an infinite number of universes. So all of the probabilistic arguments that you make in favor of the chain of life and the creation of life, none of this matters in the end because there are a bajillion universes.
Right. And we just happen to be one of them. We just happen to be the lucky ones.
Exactly.
And they call it the observer selection effect. We think we're special because all the conditions that are necessary for our existence are so incredibly improbable. But in fact, some universe somewhere had to arise that produced organisms such as ourselves, conscious, aware, conscious and intelligent agents indeed. But there's a problem with this whole approach. Many problems, in fact, and you might imagine in this new book that I'm doing, I'm writing quite a lot about the multiverse and critique of it. But let me give you the most important problem, and that is that the multiverse itself requires prior fine-tuning. The multiverse hypothesis presupposes prior fine-tuning. Here's the problem. If you have all these different universes out there, a gabillion of them, if the universes aren't in some way connected, then what happens in one universe has no material effect on events in another universe. So the fact that there may be a gabillion other universes out there, if they're disconnected, doesn't change anything in our universe, including the probabilities of our being here. So to solve that problem, and in recognition of that problem, proponents of the multiverse have proposed a common cause for all the universes so that they can portray the multiverse, all these different universes, as the result of something like a big cosmic lottery, where there's some mechanism that's churning out universes where eventually one of them would have to have the right combination of factors to make life possible. Now, the problem, though, is that in all the universe-generating mechanisms that have been proposed, there is prior fine-tuning. There's something called inflationary cosmology, and and there's something called the string theoretic landscape. So there's a string theory version of the multiverse, and there's an inflationary cosmology version. And in both cases, there has to be exquisite fine-tuning for the universe-generating mechanism to actually produce multiple universes. So the problem of the origin of the fine-tuning has just been pushed back one generation. One of my philosopher physics colleagues, Robin Collins, uses an illustration like this. He says, so imagine you have some chef presents a beautiful loaf of bread to you, and you say, oh, chef, I'd like to compliment your skill as a chef, but I know you didn't actually design the recipe. It was a bread-making machine. There was no design in this. There was just a bread-making machine that produced the bread. But even if that were the case, the bread-making machine required prior design, as did the recipe for the dough that was put in it. So this is kind of analogous to what's going on with the multiverse. It doesn't eliminate the problem of fine-tuning. It just pushes it back one generation.
Apologetics seeks to give credible answers to curious questions.
Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist. My name is Bobby Conway, and we are excited to have Lisa Fields on the program today. She is the founder of a ministry known as Jude 3, which helps to create exposure for the African American community to get hungry and passionate for Christian apologetics. And Lisa is somebody who's passionate about the subject matter herself. Good to have you on the program, Lisa.
Thank you for having me, Bobby. I appreciate it.
You bet. A question that I think you would definitely be ready to answer for us, and it's this idea, we've heard it before, is Christianity a white man's religion?
Yes, that's a question we get frequently, is Christianity a white man's religion? And the way we answer that is to push people further back in history, to say, hey, Christianity didn't black people didn't become Christians during the transatlantic slave trade only. There were people that were Africans that were Christians before. So we push people back to Tertullian, Augustine, Athanasius, who are all African church fathers. So when people see that, they realize, hey, Christianity isn't the white man's religion. Yes, it has been misused by slaveholders to oppress Africans, but let's push people further back in history beyond the transatlantic slave trade to show, hey, this religion existed before the slave trade in Africa, that people accepted, and early church fathers used it, were pivotal and foundational in the formation of it.
Is today's New Testament the same as the original that was written 2,000 years ago? Or has the original been hopelessly lost? After all, not one of the original manuscripts still exists. New Testament critic Bart Ehrman asks, what good is it to say that the original writings of the New Testament were inspired? We don't have the originals. We have only error-ridden copies, and the vast majority of these are centuries removed from the originals and different from them, evidently in thousands of ways. There are more variations among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. If we can't trust the New Testament, we can't trust what we think we know about Jesus of Nazareth, and there's no such thing as authentic Christianity. Let's look at this more closely. The New Testament and all significant literature from the ancient world is reconstructed into its original form by comparing manuscript copies that have survived. To determine the reliability of this reconstruction, historians ask 3 questions. How many copies exist? How long is the time gap between when the original was written and when the earliest surviving copy was made? And how significant are the differences between the copies? The experts have more confidence in their reconstruction of the original text when there are lots of copies to work with, the time gap is short, and the differences are relatively insignificant. Historians are confident they have reconstructed the original works of Plato and Homer with a high degree of accuracy. So let's compare these works to the New Testament. We have 219 copies of Plato, 2,300 copies of Homer, but when it comes to the New Testament, we have an overwhelming 5,700 manuscript copies in the original Greek alone. In comparison with the average ancient Greek author, the New Testament copies are well over 1,000 times more plentiful. If the average sized manuscript were 2 1/2 inches thick, all the copies of the works of the average Greek author would stack up 4 feet high, while the copies of the New Testament would stack up to over a mile high. This is indeed an embarrassment of riches. But how much time elapsed between the original writings and the earliest surviving manuscript copy? 1,300 years passed before the first surviving copy of Plato was written, and only 400 years for Homer. How about the New Testament? Just 35 years. In the world of ancient literature, this is a blink of an eye. The wealth of material that is available for determining the wording of the original New Testament is absolutely stunning. But these manuscripts are not identical. In fact, they contain roughly 400,000 differences. The obvious question then is, how significant are these variations? Most of them are simply variations in spelling, which are easy to sort out. Then we find minor differences, such as the use of synonyms or a definite article with a proper name. These have no effect on translation. There are also errors that scholars have determined were not in the original text. That means that less than 1% of all the variants have any real significance at all for the meaning of the original text. And none of these, not one, affects a single core doctrine of the Christian faith. Furthermore, in their various writings, early church leaders quoted the New Testament over 1 million times. So extensive are these citations that if all the other sources for our knowledge of the text of the New Testament were destroyed, they would be sufficient alone for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament. The overabundance of early and accurate manuscripts and quotations from those manuscripts combine to make reconstruction of the original Greek text of the New Testament virtually certain. The books of the New Testament you read today are the same as the original writings penned nearly 2,000 years ago.
I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 2 Corinthians 11:23.
After Jesus' crucifixion, the disciples lived lives of hardship for 20, 30, 40 years, suffered greatly in their ministries, and eventually suffered martyrdom and execution without recanting for their belief that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead.
I mean, what were they gaining? Were they becoming rich? They're running around the countryside. They're, in some cases, abandoning their family for periods of time so they can preach. What they got for their efforts is death, in many cases.
You also have to remember that the disciples died not just for something they believed was true. They died for something they actually saw with their own eyes. It's much more difficult to explain that away than it is for someone who dies for a belief and they're sincerely wrong.
I came across a bit of evidence I really found fascinating. James was a half-brother of Jesus, and he was not a believer in Jesus during Jesus' lifetime, but he later died the death of a martyr as a leader of the local church. In a similar way, Saul of Tarsus was a persecutor of Christians, and yet he later becomes the Apostle Paul, this incredible missionary. So I had to ask myself, what led to this radical transformation of these skeptics?
Sometimes people will come to believe something they wish to be true. If you believe hard enough that a person is loving and kind, you can talk yourself into believing that, even though the person is not loving and kind. It's very, very difficult, however, to explain people coming to believe something that they're actually standing against. Now, in the case of James and Paul, they did not believe in Jesus before his crucifixion. In fact, they thought he was deranged, and they did not accept what he said and what he taught.
James, the brother of Jesus, is a skeptic who doesn't come to Jesus until he meets the risen Lord. Critics allow that. Paul's a persecutor till he meets the risen Jesus. That's not the kind of testimony of someone who all gets together and say, hey, let's just cook this thing up.
One of the certainties, it seems to me, related to the testimony of the apostles is that they truly believed that Jesus was who he claimed he was, and they truly believed that he had risen from the dead because they were willing to die for that. Very few people are willing to die for something they don't really believe in, or something even worse that they know to be a lie.
When Jesus was executed, his disciples were rightly afraid. They scattered, they were fearful for their own life. Their hopes had been dashed because they had believed Jesus was the promised one who was going to usher a new day in for Israel. Turned out he wasn't, because he was murdered by crucifixion under the authority of the Roman Empire. And yet, shortly thereafter, we find them taking a stand in Jerusalem, proclaiming that Jesus was the Messiah, the very Son of God. How do we explain that? How do we explain the fact that they were even willing to propagate this the rest of their lives and go to martyrs' deaths for their belief? The only rational explanation is that something happened to them between the death of Jesus and 3 days later, and according to their own words, it was that they saw Jesus risen from the dead for themselves.
People have often said, and I think it's a perfectly fair position, that okay, there aren't actually any good alternative hypotheses for how you explain the rise of early Christianity, but because we know as an absolute fact which we're not prepared to let go of, that nobody ever rises from the dead, then there must in fact be some other alternative hypothesis. And I want to say, okay, if you want to make the absoluteness of bodily death the cornerstone of your entire worldview, I actually can't stop you. If you choose to say, no, here I stand, death is the end, and nobody ever comes back from it, and that's just the way it is, well, that's where a lot of people were in the ancient world, it's where a lot of people are in the modern world. I think that that worldview is radically challenged by the strong evidence which points to the resurrection of Jesus, but it's up to somebody what they do with that challenge.
Is Jesus the Messiah, the Christ, the Anointed One, the one sent by God to be the Savior of Israel and the world? Christians told me that there are dozens and dozens of ancient prophecies contained in the Old Testament of the Bible, and that they predict the coming of this Messiah, and that Jesus, against all mathematical odds, fulfill those prophecies. And I thought, this is a little bit like the fingerprint evidence you see in a court of law. I remember covering one particular case where the murderer went through the purse of the victim, and he left one thumbprint on the cellophane wrapper of a package of cigarettes. And it was that thumbprint that led to his conviction for murder. And I thought, in an analogous way, could it be that these ancient prophecies are sort of like that thumbprint on the cellophane? Do they create a thumbprint that only Jesus Christ in all of history manages to match?
This is Yeshayahu 53:6 or Isaiah 53:6. Kulanu katson ta'inu, ish ladarko paninu, vadonai hifnia bo, et avon kulanu. All of us, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. But the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. I had a friend who wrote this out on a piece of paper. He typed it up on his computer without any verse notations. And he took it around to everyone in his office. He worked in a big office for a motor vehicle bureau in one of the big states in our country. And he showed it to everyone in the motor vehicle bureau and in the state capitol. And he said, just tell me who this is and where it comes from. And every single person that looked at it, Jew or Gentile alike, it didn't matter. Everyone that looked at it read it, and he said, who is this? They said, oh, it's obviously Jesus of Nazareth. That's who it is. And it's from the New Testament. And then my friend would say, but no, it's not from the New Testament. It's from the Hebrew Bible. It was written 8 centuries before Jesus came. Can you believe this? And he showed it to them from Isaiah. And people really had a hard time, because if you read this passage without any kind of presuppositions or bias, you will read it, and it will be really clear that this is the life of Yeshua. Now, could he have fabricated this, or is this just a big coincidence?
In the Old Testament, we really have 2 kinds of prophecies. We have prophecies that are fulfilled uniquely in Christ and prophecies that are fulfilled typologically in Christ. And I do think we need to distinguish between the two. Those that are fulfilled uniquely in Christ were once and for all fulfilled by Jesus. And those are the ones that we can really point to have apologetic value. That is to demonstrate that Jesus was the only person who could have possibly fulfilled this. His birth in Bethlehem is one of those prophecies. His role as the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 is one of those prophecies. His entrance into Jerusalem on a donkey from Zechariah chapter 9. These are clear evidence that Jesus is fulfilling the Old Testament.
The most amazing part of Isaiah's prophecies is in Isaiah 9 when it speaks about the son of David coming to be the king, to sit on the throne of David and have an eternal righteous kingdom. And everyone knows it from Handel's Messiah. Unto us a son is born, unto us a child is given. And the idea of this verse is that the Messiah will actually be born, physically born. And then it says, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Father of Eternity. In other words, he's the creator, the author of time.
Some skeptics have said that Jesus could have engineered the fulfillment of these prophecies. Of course, Jesus could not have determined where he was going to be born, so to be born in Bethlehem, obviously he could not have engineered that. Also, as the suffering servant, it would have been difficult for him to engineer such a specific fulfillment of Isaiah 53. But on the other hand, the fact that Jesus performed certain actions that in fact fulfilled prophecies only demonstrates that he was indeed the Messiah. Anyone who enters Jerusalem riding on a donkey, in obvious fulfillment of Zechariah 9:9, is saying, yes, I am the Messiah. So we certainly have a glimpse in that fulfilled prophecy of the self-consciousness of Jesus, that he truly believed that he was the Messiah.
Scholars have determined that Jesus fulfilled at least 4 dozen major prophecies, each written a minimum of 3 centuries before his birth. Their content ranged from specific details about his life to the symbolic implications of his death.
Psalm 22 gives a poetic picture by David, written in the first person, of what the Messiah will be like in his suffering. And one of the things he says is that they will pierce my hands and my feet. Now, David wrote before crucifixion was known, probably by about 300 years. So Isaiah 53 says he was pierced through. It gives us the reason for his death. He was pierced through for our iniquities. So there's a purpose. He dies not just because he's a martyr, but because he's a substitution for sin.
A college professor of mathematics and science named Dr. Peter Stoner wanted to determine what the odds were that any human being throughout history could fulfill the messianic prophecies. So he had his students come up with very conservative estimates of the likelihood of any human being fulfilling certain of these predictions, and then they just ran the numbers. And what they determined is that the odds of any human being fulfilling 48 of these ancient prophecies would be one chance in a trillion.
It is mathematically virtually impossible.
To me, just as significant as all of those unique prophecies that were fulfilled in Christ is the complete drama of the Old Testament. The fact that the Old Testament is the story, the narrative of God's redemptive movement, his movement to deliver and save humanity. And Jesus is the climax of that movement. He is the climax of salvation history, the one who brings it off to fulfillment. You read the Old Testament, it's building. Jesus arrives on the scene and he is the fulfillment. And he recognizes himself clearly as the climax of God's plan of salvation for all humanity.
This whole case was sort of like one of those jigsaw puzzles where you don't know what the ultimate picture is going to be. You just put together the pieces, and as I was putting together all of the evidence, it started to take shape, and I sort of stepped back and I could see that it was a portrait of Jesus Christ.
But I decide to write this piece. So I write an op-ed, Is Science Leading Us to God? And I think, who's going to publish something like this? Maybe, FoxNews.com might publish it. I really don't know. But I wrote it, and I thought, well, the first place, of course, you got to start at the top just in case they might take it. Yeah, you know that they won't, but it would be wrong not to send it. So I sent it to the Wall Street Journal. Now, the weird thing is, it just so happened, and this is maybe not in the realm of miracle, but it struck me as at least fascinating that I just bumped into somebody at a Socrates in the City event who is one of the editors of the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal. I'd never had a connection at the Wall Street Journal, whatever, and so I sent this to that person, and they published it. They changed the title to Science Increasingly Makes the Case for God. So a little too on the nose for me. I wanted it to be a little bit more like, see what you think. But they published it. They published it in the online version. I guess it was Christmas Eve, I think, or Christmas Day. I don't remember. And then it was in the paper the next day. Well, my daughter and wife and I were driving up to Vermont to go skiing because we don't have Utah or Colorado on the East Coast. And as we're going up, the Wall Street Journal online still would tell you like how many Facebook shares or whatever. Like you could see the number on the article. And it was funny because Tim Keller, who was the pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian in New York City, kind of a big deal. Some of you have read his books. He'd been profiled or written something in the Wall Street Journal, and he had his article had reached 15,000 Facebook shares. And I thought, wow, I wonder how many this article is going to get. I'm just, you always want to know, you want some metric, something to see, is anybody reading this, So as we're driving up, I'm obviously driving, can't look at my phone, but my daughter every now and again tells me like, well, it's up to 7,000 Facebook shares. I'm like, uh-oh, Tim Keller's in trouble. I'm breathing down his neck. He thinks he's such a big shot. I might be able to topple him. Let's see what happens. Well, by the time I hit the Massachusetts border on I-91, I believe we were tied with Tim Keller. Now, something inside me want to call him up and say, ha. But I lost his number, and I know he might not appreciate the joke because he has no sense of humor. And he doesn't like people. I shouldn't say that publicly. That's not true. But I thought, this is weird. Like 15,000 Facebook shares on an 850-word piece that tells you about the fine-tuning of the universe. Now, keep in mind, I am not a scientist. I read books by scientists, and I knew that most people, including most Christians had never heard of these scientists, which is a scandal itself. If we lived in a normal culture, all of those scientists would be as popular as Neil deGrasse Tyson or Bill Nye the Science Guy. I mean, we just live in an insane world where that point of view is put out constantly, and you never even hear the other side, which happens to be true. Not only does the other side happen to be true, but it has such a sick level of evidence that it's not like, it looks true. It's a slam dunk. But the article got published, and it promptly went insane. By the time we were settled into our hotel in Vermont, it was not just passing Tim Keller's 15,000 Facebook shares, it was at 100,000 Facebook shares. And you can imagine, yes, who knew that anything good could come out of Facebook? Which is evil and fascist, but we'll talk about that another time. So, no joke, folks, it went over the course of the next couple of weeks, quote unquote viral. It went to well over 300,000 Facebook shares. And somebody who's an editor at the Journal emailed me and said, by the way, I know off the record that if it is at that level, it is literally the most popular article in the history of the Wall Street Journal. Yeah. And it kept going. And it's now at something like 650,000 Facebook shares. It is more than double of any article that they have ever had shared. So the question is, why is it so popular? And most of us know it's my writing. Obviously, I wrote it, and it's just that good. But there are other factors. Thanks to the internet, it just went that crazy. And it went so crazy that people of whom I'd never heard before, like Lawrence Krauss, decided somebody needs to take a stand against this nonsense. So people started writing rebuttals and rebuttals. And he wrote a long piece in the New Yorker. And even though I'm not a scientist, I'm smart enough to be able to read that piece and understand he did not have a single valid point to refute what I said. That didn't stop them from publishing it. You'll notice you can't suppress it because every atom in your body is signed by Yahweh, by Jesus, the Lord of hosts. You can't escape it. And so you might hate it. It's like being tattooed with the name Jesus all over you and you're an atheist. And it's like, that's going to be a tough life. What are you going to do? You're going to scratch it all off? What are you going to do? Tough. The Creator signed his work and you're it.
The Bible, the greatest epic ever written, spanning the entire history of humanity. From Adam's first breath in the Garden of Eden to the final song of the redeemed in eternity. It tells of kings crowned and deposed, nations created and destroyed, dynasties raised up and brought to the ground. Armies clash, cities are built and destroyed, and prophets point to the future. Through it all, God is carrying out his plan to save mankind. It is beautifully complex, with dozens of themes and hundreds of symbols woven together like a symphony until they come to rest on the shoulders of one man, Jesus. Throughout Scripture, right from the beginning, this man, the Christ, has been the point of everything. The Bible's promises are about him. The crown has been forged for his head. The prophets have spoken about him. This epic is not fiction, but history. Stories can inspire, but this one, with all its twists and turns, tells what actually is. God really did create human beings in his image, and they rebelled against him. And he did send Jesus to save them from their sins, to redeem them. This isn't just a story. This is our story, our epic. It's the story of redemption.
Well, the book is Darwin's Doubt. The author is Stephen Meyer. Stephen, thanks so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we covered a lot. Thank you.